Putin has secured yet another term as president of the Russian Federation. But in his inauguration speech, he goes full mask off. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to take a look at the text of this and figure out just what he's talking about and why it's so disturbing. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is the full transcript of his inauguration speech. Now, you guys know that he has, at least within Russia, the trappings of an electoral democracy. He holds elections, there's an inauguration speech, he even has allied political parties run against him. But every year, of course, Putin wins, usually by about 90% of the vote. This year, about 87%. And that's because of a huge large-scale ballot stuffing, and oftentimes people don't really need to, they know who to vote for. They know who they need to vote for, and they know that because oftentimes these ballots are not private, right? They're done under the observation of police and military. Sometimes they don't even need to be told which candidate to vote for. They just can simply figure it out. It's the person who's in charge of the police officer who's staring at you. So, this doesn't necessarily mean this inauguration speech does not necessarily reflect a complete vision the way a competitive electoral democracy would bring in a candidate with a different, fresh vision that was distinct from their opponent. But Putin still considers this election to be important because it is not an opportunity to decide which leader is going to lead Russia. Right? It was always Putin, but it is an opportunity to see how much the people love you. Do they love you only a lot or a whole lot? That actually is, it sounds crazy, but it's actually a real fear that autocrats like Putin have. And that's because they need they don't need broad, overwhelming support, right? That's something that an elected leader needs. But what he needs is a hardcore base of people and enough people content that they aren't willing to rebel or question or work against the fundamental system that he's created. So again, while he doesn't need an electoral win, he needs to maintain a certain level of popularity. So it's interesting, though, once he has that mandate from this election, then he is going to lay out his vision of Russia. What does he plan to do? And when we take a look, we can see he starts off the bat and lets you know what's up. All right. He opens, "Dear citizens of Russia, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends." All right. He, of course, thanks, but listen to who he thanks in his very first line, his opening line, right? He would like to sincerely thank citizens of Russia in all regions of our country, right? Russia, of course, a wide-ranging country with a lot of different ethnicities, languages, and frankly, economic development, right? You can go into suburbs of Moscow that are as wealthy as any in Berlin or London or New York, and you can go into rural Russia and see true third world developing country conditions. But here's who else he shouts out: the residents of our historic lands, who, he says, defended the right to be together with the motherland. That is really weird, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, when he talks about historic lands, this is code in this context for primarily Ukraine. And you know that part of Putin's ideological vision for Ukraine is to restore what he believes are lands that are historically Russian that have been stripped from Russia. And he believes that the residents he considers them like a Russian diaspora, kind of like how Cubans in the United States still consider themselves Cuban, and they think that the Cuban government, their homeland, has been sort of occupied or seized by a communist dictator, right? And so that is sort of the perspective that Putin is trying to push with this historic lands argument, right? And when he says who defended the right to be together with the motherland, that's a direct reference to DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is a area that in 2014 was a, let's see if we can find it, the Donetsk People's Republic. Here we go. This is it says internationally unrecognized Republic of Russia right now. But prior to this, and since about 2014, the DPR was actually created by Russian-backed paramilitaries who ousted the Ukrainian government and then claimed that they were a breakaway state until about 2022, when Russia said, actually, you're ours. You are our sovereign territory. And the other one is, of course, the LPR, the Luhansk People's Republic. You can see they're both located in eastern Ukraine and were Russian-backed from the start. But these regions quickly raised paramilitaries, right, and fought the Ukrainian military in 2014 and actually remained in a low-intensity conflict with Ukraine for 10 years prior to the Russian invasion. So in some ways, right, this is not, we think of the Ukraine war as having started in 2022, but to a Ukrainian, they would say, no, we've actually been at war in the East since 2014 for 10 years. And their military, while it never had to confront Russia head on, it still remained kind of in this sort of balance of power where Russia would intervene enough to prop up the DPR and LPR states. Now, of course, once Russia invaded, it decided it didn't need to keep the pretext that they were independent republics. Instead, it simply said, you are part of Russia, your people are Russian, and this was part of a long Russian campaign. They would hand out passports, Russian passports to residents of the DPR and LPR. It was a whole thing. And again, this is part of, I think this is close to Putin's actual beliefs as we can get, right? Is when he discloses this sort of thing. Of course, he also says, I want to bow to our heroes, participants in the special military operation, and everyone who fights for the fatherland. Well, they're all in the dirt, so, you're going to have to bow down to say hi to them. But he then knows I'm addressing every single citizen of Russia. Right. And he says that, he talks about the mission of the head of state to protect Russia and serve our people. And what's also interesting is that he never really acknowledges that there's only one instance in which he acknowledges that the citizens of Russia, did the fake vote. He says, you, citizens of Russia, have confirmed the correctness of the country's course, which is really interesting because that's exactly what they did do. As I said, the vote is not about candidate A or candidate B. It's a chance to show your love for, in this case, Putin, right? Or at least show your compliance with the regime. So, yes, it's sort of like an error message, right? Where it comes up on your screen and it goes, error, and you have one button. You can just say, okay. Like, you've confirmed that the error has happened. This is what they've done, right? Or think of it as like when you get a new privacy notice on your phone, they don't give you an option to decline because otherwise it'll brick your phone. They just say you read it and you say, I agree. And he says, you, citizens of Russia, you've agreed to the privacy notice. Be advised. This is you now have agreed to new terms and conditions. Unfortunately, Putin himself is kind of honest about his terms and conditions. First off, he describes himself as saving people. And I think he means saving the people or the Russian people. And he says, I'm confident that support for centuries-old family values and traditions will continue to unite the public and religious associations, political parties, and all levels of government. And he says all our country's decisions must be oriented around the Russian family. Now, this is not this sounds like a religious or value statement, but it's not. It's hard geopolitics because Russia has a extremely low fertility rate. It's actually a massive problem for Russia. To give you an idea, the Russian fertility rate, 1.49 births per woman in 2021, compared to the United States, who was at 1.66, right? So the United States having about a 10% higher birth rate, though Ukraine, an even worse birth rate at about 1 birth per woman. And some of these things are reflective, right? For context, China about 1.16, Iran 1.69, Israel 3. Interesting. Religious countries tend to have larger families and higher birth rates. But this is a huge geopolitical crisis for Russia. You can see that Russia had an above replacement birth rate and higher than the United States, actually, in 1987. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, women were having way less kids. In fact, in 2000, the United States, again, just a smidge below replacement, whereas Russia had plummeted to 1.2. And Russia has been trying to recover, but then, of course, 2016, you've seen the fertility rate plummet again. And the problem is that a society was going to have massive struggles when it has this persistently low fertility rate, because Russia needs workers, right? An economy cannot be run, just like you can't have an economy with nothing but children because they can't work. You can't have an economy that's overwhelmingly the aged, because they also are unable to work, right? You get older, you get sick. This is like the core human experience. And so what you end up with when an economy skews too heavy, just like when it skews too young, right? When the average woman has like 6 kids, you end up with a society in which just child rearing takes up too much of the economy. Too many adults have to spend their time and days managing children and children's issues. When you have a low fertility rate, you end up with a country where too many people are caring for and managing the elderly. And unlike a high number of children, where if you wait a decade or a decade and a half, those children become economically productive, old people just become dead. So you end up with a society that just simply is a drain and never transitions to being economically productive. It is a massive problem. And again, you see, we're not the only country dealing with it. China has an even worse fertility problem, really tremendously bad. The United States also has it needs to be honest with itself, also has a severe fertility problem. And the solutions are generally, what they've found is the few countries that have reversed this fertility decline have done so because they've created a lot of incentives around having kids, support for having children, right? And this actually makes a lot of sense. It's not so much to incentivize people to have children, it's to provide children stability. And once you know that you bring a child into the world, that you're going to be able to work, your career is going to be secure, you're not going to be jeopardizing your economic future, then people will have children, right? So Putin has correctly identified this as a looming geopolitical challenge for Russia. And that's why he says the family values, which is usually code for women having lots of kids, and traditions, right? And are the North Star that aligns his governmental vision. But the other thing that's really interesting is that he says, we do not refuse dialogue with Western states. Again, we're early in the speech here, relatively speaking, right? We're maybe halfway in. He says, we don't refuse dialogue with Western states. He said, but the choice is there. So they continue to try to restrain the development of Russia and continue their policy of aggression, continuous pressure on our country for years, or look for a path to cooperation and peace. He says, we can have a conversation on security and strategic stability. But he says, but not from a position of strength with arrogance, conceit, or personal exclusivity. And what that says is, you have to let Russia become stronger. Because here's the problem. Russia is not that big an economy. Militarily, they're very big, right? But he literally lays out, he's like, Russia must become stronger than the Western countries in order to have the equal footing and respect that it wants. And what's also interesting is that he says, listen, we plan on continuing to dominate the Eurasian region. He says our partners in Eurasian integration, which is an interesting term, right? The NATO, some of our forces, some aspects of NATO involve integration, but we are not integrated. Canada has its own central bank. It has its own trade policies. It has its own laws. It is an independent country. There is little integration, even with our closest neighbors, let alone with NATO partners like Turkey. So he says, we are looking to Eurasian integration and to form a multipolar world and an equal, indivisible security system. Another interesting word to drop in here, indivisible security system. Again, NATO is not an indivisible security system, right? NATO has lots of divisions. It is very hard to get consensus. Even among popular topics like Ukraine aid, the details are often messy. So the saying that you're going to be part of an indivisible security system means that it essentially has to be a dictatorship, right? The only way to have a strong, indivisible security system is to have one entity have absolute authority. So you see, he's kind of alluding to his plan. And when we look at not just the article in Wikipedia for Russian imperialism, but this is the map of Russia's historic lands. And this is really important because if you look at this, you can gain a pretty sophisticated understanding of Putin's plans, right? So we zoom in here, get to about 150. So notice that if you're Putin and you look at this map and you say, this is true Russia, right? This is sort of the Ruski Mir ideology and Alexander Dugin and all these other guys. He says, this is true Russia. Everything in color on this map. And the current Russia that Putin is in charge of, he believes is a rump state. So you can understand how Poland becoming a NATO member, right? Russia would go, well, wait, no, in 1815, Warsaw became a Russian satellite state, and it was a Russian satellite state until 1987. Sure, the Poles may have voted and said they want a different outcome to be a part of NATO or to be their own country, but Putin doesn't care about that. He believes Russia's entitled to the furthest boundaries it's ever held, it's ever occupied. So it says that, listen, Poland should be ours. And that... he says the same thing about the Caucasus. You can see all the way down the South Caspian. Here's Georgia, Tbilisi, right? Way south. He wants to abut Turkey in the north. He wants to own parts of China and Manchuria, even parts of, you can see here, Alaska, at times even parts of Japan, historic islands in this region. Russia feels it has a claim to all of them. They view it all as Russian historic lands. And of course, you can see deep purple here is everything up to Kiev. And so when you say this, you say, okay, now I understand why Putin may believe that NATO is being aggressive. Because, yeah, NATO said, listen, these countries are independent countries now. Russia never really controlled them. They were never the Russian people. Georgians consider themselves Georgians. Ukrainians consider themselves Ukrainians. Poles consider themselves Poles. None of them consider themselves Russian. So they have a right to decide what kind of country they have. And they are their own country, which Russia viewed as offensive. Then those countries voted for different sets of policies. Poland said, hey, we'd love to become a NATO member. NATO voted. They said, sure, you're welcome to come into the fold, right? But remember, up until last year, Finland never did that. Sweden never did that, right? So, Georgia, not a NATO member, but its own independent country. And this is the context you have to see. This is the map that explains everything about Putin. This is why he views what NATO does as aggression and not simply a voluntary membership organization. It's why he views it as hostile to Russia, because he believes they are annexing Russian territory, Russia's historic lands. And this, to me, is the core part of it. And the positivist vision, right? The thing that Putin is trying to make, he lays it out here if you look into the words, right? A Eurasian integration and an indivisible security system, right? Who's going to dominate that security system? Moscow. Just like we know, because when the Soviet Union had control over these regions, who dominated that indivisible security system? Moscow, right? It was that they were, all of these other countries in the Soviet system were satellite states. So when you consider that this is Putin's vision, right? You realize exactly what he is. He's just a Russian imperialist, right? That's all he wants. He wants the restoration of the Russian Empire. And that's why he said it himself when he had his long interview with Tucker Carlson. That's why he spent 45 minutes talking about Russian imperial history, because he believes he is a continuation of this 1,000-year program to build the Russian state into this empire, right? And you see, this is a 1,000-year journey almost. 1,300 is some of the earliest cited control regions, but it stretches all the way again to now 2022. So a 700 or 800 year program. And, you know, when you're someone like Putin, who's probably, in terms of wealth he controls, he's probably the wealthiest person to ever live. And he's probably one of the most powerful single individuals, given the fact that unlike the United States, where we kind of cycle through leaders, right? So no one person has total power. Putin has had total power of the world's second largest nuclear arsenal for decades. So once you reach that point, you start to ask yourself questions about, like, who am I? What do I want to achieve? What is my role in history? Like, he accepts it. He is now a historic figure. And that's what he wants. He wants to bring Russia from what he considers the rump status to its former glory. All right. Now, of course, he acknowledges that his socio-political system must be strong and resistant to any challenges and threats to ensure the progression and stability of development, unity, and independence of the country, right? So again, you see some strong dictatorship vibes and a little bit of an oblique reference to the Wagner coup attempt, right? Where he says, our state and socio-political system must be strong and absolutely resistant to any challenges and threats, right? And he emphasizes stability, unity, and independence. These are kind of watchwords, especially in this context, for a stronger, more dictatorial regime. And we know, of course, they've already outlawed any sort of dissent against their invasion of Ukraine. So it's only a matter of time, he says, before we increase. Right? He said, he's kind of alluded to the fact that the system must be strong and absolutely resistant to challenges. That tells you he's planning on cracking down more heavily on other freedoms of speech and expression and dissent. So he, of course, acknowledges, right? He wraps it up by acknowledging, yes, everything in my power to justify your trust, do this, the powers that head of state, enshrined in the Constitution, da, da, da. But then here's the thing. His final paragraphs. Today, we are answerable to our 1,000-year history and our ancestors. They literally, he says, they conquered seemingly inaccessible heights because they always put their motherland first. They knew they could only achieve great goals together with a country and their people. So very interesting. Again, you see, together, country, people. That message is also clear. Remember, all of these he considers Russian people. He told you at the beginning of the speech. He said, all the people, residents of our historic lands. He's like, you're in this too. And he talked about unifying the country into its people, right? Literally says, listen, we used to do it. We conquered these inaccessible heights. Which it could be spiritual conquest, sure, but in this context, I think it means literal conquest. They literally conquered seemingly inaccessible parts of the country or parts of the world. So, again, talking about how these historic triumphs inspires today, and of course alludes to Russia becoming a world power. So guys, you could see that Putin is pretty straightforward about his vision, and it's really interesting. Once you see it laid out like that, the source of conflict becomes obvious, that Putin never really accepted the idea that some peoples who were under Soviet and before that Imperial Russian dominion didn't want to be there. Anyway, if you feel like you are under the dominion of a little too much, you don't need to, annex yourself into your own country. You may just need a little bit of an energy boost. You should check out Strike Gum. I developed this in partnership with Liquid Core Gum right here in the USA. So it's made right here with high quality ingredients. It has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, a absolutely massive amount of caffeine for a piece of gum. This is the equivalent of about a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, and you get 5 of them in every pack. And if you're interested, check it out, strikegum.com. That's where you can get your veteran discounts and your new customer discounts. But if you're an Amazon customer, just go to amazon.com, search for Strike Gum, or check the link in the description and pick some up. And thanks to the dozens of people who've left us 5-star reviews on Amazon, you know that makes all the difference for Amazon products, right? Lets people know that this isn't some made overseas nonsense, right? Made here in the USA, natural caffeine, because that way I know it's legit. I can put my name behind it. Anyway, thanks to all the Combat Vet News members. See you in the next one. Cheers.